So, Mark Zuckerberg has written 6,500-ish words about our inevitable AI future, as he sees it, and I've read all of them several times now so that you don't have to. You're welcome. Go out and pat a dog for me. But why would I do this to myself? Well, I'm a philosopher by trade, and it is a humble one, I admit that. But when someone like Mark Zuckerberg, one of the richest men in the world, opens his Tractatus with the line, quote, "It is important to develop a philosophy for how we can best use superintelligence," I can't help myself. To quote Silvio Dante, just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. It's like the sound of fresh biscuits hitting the bowl for our cat, Mr. Elliot. He must come and investigate. And so too, when the word philosophy is used, must I. But here's my promise. I'll try to be quick and I'll try to be fair, because I think this statement by the CEO of Meta, who's now one of the key players in the future of AI, is really significant. And not just because of who is saying it, or because of his arguments or interests, although we'll get to those, they are important, but because Zuckerberg's logic, his rhetoric, the evidence he musters, and his way of arguing in the piece are all clear examples of a whole genre of AI literature and quasi-philosophy. It is essentially a tech bro manifesto from someone who has a lot to gain, and I'd argue, like all of us, a lot to lose too, on how this technology transforms our societies and the way we live. So let's pull it apart. Let's see how it works. Let's do some nuts and bolts philosophy. And in the process, maybe we can make up our minds about how plausible we think Zuckerberg's potential future is, how desirable it may be, and what's being hidden from us along the way. Because make no mistake, these manifestos are circulating amongst certain elites, and they are structuring the economics, the politics, and even the experiences that us in the rest of the world are having. The manifesto itself is called "The Future is for Everyone," and it was published publicly on the 10th of August via Meta's PR accounts, and it was signed Mark. Also, saying publicly is doing a lot of work here because, as we'll see, this manifesto has appeared before, just in a different form. And in fairness to Mark, I'm going to give the best possible case for what he claims and what he's arguing before we get into the deconstruction. And it has 5 core parts, which I'll quickly run through now. The first premise is this. It's that superintelligence is coming. Not that it might be, but that it is, and that we just have to accept that. Now, please hold your interrogation of whether this premise is sound for the end, because at the moment, I'm just straight up presenting the logic of Mark Zuckerberg's argument. Then the second premise that he uses is that the history of technological innovation basically tells us, hey guy, relax. Because every transformative technology, say the printing press or electricity or the internet, arrived with an inevitable accompanying moral panic in Zuckerberg's argument, and yet they delivered prosperity anyway. So AI will continue this pattern, Zuckerberg argues. And again, stay on target, gold leader, because the third part is not quite a premise, but it's not quite an argument in itself either. Zuckerberg claims that the purpose of superintelligence is invention, not automation, and that the practical effect of putting AI in your hands is that it makes you more capable. It's also a bit of a historical argument too, because he says that people adapt faster than jobs disappear, so new and better work follows it. Again, it's a kind of relax guys premise and argument. Now, the fourth part is again a premise that contains multitudes of arguments, basically the whole of political philosophy to date, because he claims that safety is a question of balance of power, and that no single superintelligence, which will inevitably arrive, see premise 1, can be benevolent for everyone, because we don't agree on what the good means. So only competing interests and competing superintelligences can hold each other in check. Then there's the conclusion, part 5, the moment all of these premises, sub-arguments and inferences have been building towards. Zuckerberg concludes, therefore, that personal superintelligence for billions of people, open models, colossal infrastructure, a light regulatory touch, American leadership, and a government as a supportive partner rather than as an obstacle are essential to ensure this access and this competition, and therefore that future that he foresees. But I'm betting you couldn't contain yourself while I was laying down those arguments and premises. I bet that you, like me, were saying, hey, wait a minute, at the historical claims at the very least. And perhaps you were even shouting at the top of your voice by the time we got to how Mark thinks power works. So yes, There's a lot in there, a lot that Mark takes for granted, cherry picks, or assumes is settled when it's actually highly contentious. And that's what we'll get to next. Plus, if you're enjoying this philosophical content, then please consider giving us a like, hype, and subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. And also, if you just want to walk away here and enjoy the rest of your life, I'll give you my short verdict on Zuckerberg's arguments now. As a philosopher who's taught way too many undergrads the basics of how arguments work, this one doesn't. Now, AI is a big topic touching on every aspect of our lives, and Zuckerberg has only used about 6,500 words or so. So, of course, he isn't going to solve the nearly 3 millennia of philosophical argument over the nature of the good, natural right, or its influence over Western political philosophy in this essay to make it all work. So, I don't want to be uncharitable, because AI and its issues touch on so many legitimately contested aspects of our lives that we just don't have time to fully cover here. Instead, in dealing with Zuckerberg's arguments and their flaws, I want to focus on what I think are the 3 essential pillars that need to stand for Zuckerberg's arguments in the manifesto to succeed. The first is his use of historical analogy. Is this a good way to reason? Has Mark used it well? And is he consistent? It may surprise you to learn that the answer to all 3 of those questions is no. Secondly, we'll look at the power and the politics of it all, particularly Mark's essential claim that access equals power. It doesn't, and in a very mean twist, we can actually use Mark's own thought experiment against him to show this. And thirdly, and finally, every argument, no matter how good, has implicit premises. And in this manifesto, they're killer, because it will not amaze you to discover that often Mark's reasoning very neatly aligns with his own economic interests. So let's get into it. So, when reading a philosopher's work, we tend to take them on their own standards, on their own terms, even if eventually we might think that we will disagree with those standards. Because what we're looking for, at least in the first instance, at a base level, is logical consistency. And the real problem for Mark Zuckerberg's argument in the manifesto is his use of history. Because yes, it is cherry-picked and it is very convenient for the narrative that he wants to tell. And as we'll see, he's not actually logically consistent with it either in how he deploys it. And if you've insisted on historical precedent in one section of your argument, then you kind of can't run away from it when another section when it clearly shows something that you don't like. But that's what Mark does. And that starts in the section about innovation, where he gives us this little potted history of the Wright brothers in their bicycle shop and Michael Faraday experimenting away on his own with electricity, or Jobs and Wozniak in their garage creating Apple. It's a lovely story, and Mark wants to use it to argue that it's individual creativity and experimentation that drives innovation, that sparks the big things that change our world, not the institutions, as he argues, because they're kind of the villains in the story that he's trying to tell, that stand in the way and they try to regulate and they say no. And I'll be honest, I've been a part of big institutions. Often they do feel stifling like that, like Mark's not pulling this from nowhere. And sometimes it does take, as much as I hate to admit it, a John Galt with a good idea, the vision, and the stamina to see it through. But the grand irony here is that all of the innovations that Mark Zuckerberg relies on for his Randian vision of the future and of AI are things like the internet, GPS, the nuclear power that they want to use for data centers, even touchscreens. All of these were actually developed by huge institutions, ones like CERN, NASA, Bell Labs, DARPA, the Manhattan Project, and a century or more of university research. And just as an aside, the economist Mariana Mazzucato, for example, spent a career showing how many of these innovations were state-funded and collaborative across many teams of people in institutions long before they were anybody's garage project. And here's one institution it seems odd for Mark not to mention, considering he built it: Meta. Yes, the hymn to the lone inventor comes from a CEO with over 75,000 employees, and which is spending about $145 billion this year alone on centralized research infrastructure. So philosopher Mark believes that the future comes from the garage, but CEO Mark is building the biggest data center his company has ever attempted across nearly 3,500 acres of rural Louisiana to pursue that research. One of them must be wrong. And it gets dicier still when we look at his history of people and their jobs, because he claims that people adapt faster than the work disappears and that they move into better jobs. A century or two ago, for example, the argument runs We were all subsistence farmers, and now look at us go. But that is not the whole story, and actually the historical and economic evidence on this is quite contested. It's a whole nother video, but in short, it's not something that you could take for granted and make that direct triumphant conclusion from. The evidence is mixed. Plus, think about now and how it might be different with AI and with superintelligence. Because, for example, economists at Stanford who track this currently find that employment among youngest workers in AI-exposed occupations is running about 19%. Below where it should be. There are more people unemployed. It's having a big impact. While in contradiction, Yale's economists actually find that there's really no significant economy-wide disruption at all yet. So both could kind of be right, as the damage may be real and narrow in certain places at the same time, but we just don't know yet, and we have a lot of qualitative evidence to weigh against Mark's conclusion too. But a philosopher facing this kind of split evidence would be more honest. They would say the evidence is split and the history is complicated. Instead, Mark's manifesto gives us a reading of the contested evidence that is most useful to his case and that covers over the rest. But look, cherry picking, historical analogies, convenient readings of complex indicators. We've all done it, haven't we? You know, when trying to win an argument with someone really annoying. But the logical inconsistency is biggest when Mark tellingly stops using history. Because when he gets to the risks of AI as opposed to its benefit, suddenly history isn't a very good guide anymore, he argues. It all centers around the question of proliferation and whether having access to AI might actually raise the risks of certain attacks or threats, or putting advanced destructive technologies like biological weapons in bad actors' hands is something that AI might actually do. And to respond to that concern, he writes, I think it is important to approach this risk with additional humility because there are a few historical precedents to suggest how likely or unlikely it may be. It has been possible for bad actors to synthesize harmful compounds for decades, but this has rarely become a significant issue, perhaps because the financial motivation that exists for cyber attacks is not present here. That said, if we begin to see harmful examples emerge, then we should adjust our strategy appropriately to mitigate the risk. I'm trying to take him on good faith, but there's so much to pull apart in that. Like, now it's important to have additional humility, not before when you were using history to make grand statements. And it has been possible for bad actors to synthesize harmful compounds for decades, but this has rarely become a significant issue. Except there's lots of history and precedents, particularly on how new communications technologies have helped spread dangerous knowledge to new actors, including chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, or how new technologies themselves have absolutely enabled more destructive acts by radical actors. In 1984, for example, the Rajneeshi cult poisoned salad bars in Oregon and sickened 751 people. Shinrikyo ran a full anthrax program in the 90s and sprayed it off a Tokyo rooftop. It failed only because they cultured a harmless strain. The 2001 anthrax letters killed 5 people. And experts who study this often agree the death toll stayed low because all of these technical barriers of the dissemination of knowledge held. Shinrikyo tried, but they couldn't replicate a whole government research program. And now a superintelligent AI could be the Manhattan program in a deranged doomsday cult's pocket. So contra Mark, the history doesn't counsel humility about the evidence we have. It counsels terror about the capabilities we'll likely unleash. And Mark's argument only gets stranger. He has a great example of open model security, his preferred let everybody have access to everything approach, which he says works. He writes, on cybersecurity, widely developed open source systems have proven more secure because more people can identify vulnerabilities, harden the system, and easily upgrade to the latest, most secure versions. Even in recent weeks, we have seen companies handling security incidents like Hugging Face rely on widely available open models to patch vulnerabilities, which is not what happened. In a recent Hugging Face security incident, a combination of OpenAI's models, confined supposedly to a sandbox so they couldn't harm anybody, broke containment. They then accessed the internet and they set up shop attacking and exploiting Hugging Face's production systems. The actual details of it are thrilling and probably coming to a cinema near you soon. For example, the model, after individual attacks, left notes for itself that nobody else could read just in case it came back in future and wanted tips for exploiting further systems. Check it out. It's fascinating and it's horrifying at the same time, just like the way AIs play chess. But yes, After this pretty disturbing application of not even superintelligence, but perhaps its precursors, Hugging Face did use freely available models to clean up the mess. But that's like experiencing a preventable flood and then focusing afterwards on the great mop you used to clean it all up. That's not quite the problem here, Mark. None of the logic here holds, particularly when Mark chooses to be guided by history and then suddenly chooses not to be. Plus, the history that he does cite is highly contestable, and I'd argue that the history he strategically ignores on the success of non-proliferation regimes, for example, versus the alternative, is actually pretty clear. He has it backwards. But we got to move forwards onto problem number 2. Because to give credit where credit is due, when Mark moves from the use of history to the implications of political philosophy for AI, he raises some very interesting questions with a long philosophical pedigree. And it starts with the idea of the good life, which Mark reasonably points out people disagree on endlessly. Philosophers call this value pluralism, and it isn't a bug in humanity. It may well be the central fact and feature of our politics, the very thing it is built to accommodate, or not accommodate in the case of some regimes. But he does point to a key problem. A single superintelligence made use of by everybody would have to pick someone's values and govern everybody else with them. And a benevolent God is impossible when we can't agree on what that benevolence is. So don't build a God, perhaps, is my answer. But Mark's argument is that what we should do instead is distribute this power into many highly capable superintelligences and let them kind of, check each other. If that line of argument sounds a bit familiar, then it should. That's James Madison and Montesquieu and many other philosophers to boot. It's the core idea behind, for example, separation of powers in our modern democratic systems, imported into AI governance. And if Mark had submitted those 3 pages to a philosophy seminar, we'd have a good old afternoon nattering about them. He even provides a very nice thought experiment, the superintelligent lawyer. If I have one and you have one, then in court, neither of us gets steamrolled, which is very nice. But, and you knew there was always going to be a but. But Mark's key premise is that power should be balanced, and his conclusion is, therefore, everyone should get access to AI. But those don't follow from each other, do they? Because access and power are often very different things. And we can see this most clearly in Meta's proposed price model for superintelligence. Yes, everyone gets a baseline of intelligence for nothing. The first taste is always free. But additional compute is sold through what he calls dynamic auction. That's an auction, folks, when the thing under the hammer is intelligence itself. So let's get back to that lawyer example and test it out, shall we? Because say I have my own superintelligent lawyer free of charge. Thanks, Meta. That's lovely. But a hedge fund that perhaps I'm suing or whatever, we might buy 500,000 of them, bought at Mark's auction. And a government can have, millions? And whatever intelligence money can buy, the richest people on earth can buy way more of it. A category which, I note in passing, includes the author of that manifesto. So access, even under Mark's utopian model, does not equal power. Money does. Of course it does. Meta is ultimately a business. This, for me, is one of the biggest flaws in the whole manifesto. And yes, I'm aware that there are a lot more of them too that I haven't even got to and probably won't get to in this video. And if I've missed it, pop the one that inflames you the most in the comments below and we'll discuss it at length there. But the big logical flaw, on Mark's own terms, in his own manifesto, is that technology can make every individual more capable and at the same time actually widen the gap between individuals. It can do both at once. It's that super. Because if compute is for sale to the highest bidder, then handing everyone an AI doesn't flatten the existing distribution of power. It takes that distribution and it multiplies it many times over. Mark's manifesto never distinguishes access from power, and every sentence is hoping that we kind of don't notice that. And let's jump back quickly to the proliferation point I raised in the history section a few minutes ago, because the key inference we're examining here, that access equals power and that's good, fails in a second way too. Mark's example is good. It's 2 sides straightforwardly adversarial with no one getting killed at the end. It works where the conflict is adversarial and survivable. But how does the logic of access work with stuff like nuclear weapons? Like every state with nuclear weapons because they could buy the compute to work it out. That's the Cold War on steroids, or with chemical and biological weapons then, if that's too extreme for you. Because hey, everyone having a smallpox capability is not an epidemiological balance. Also, in cybersecurity and in biology, offense and defense aren't symmetric. The attacker needs one hole, but the defender has to guard all of them, and a single success can be catastrophic. Mark's system assumes, without ever arguing it, that defense keeps pace with offense in every domain at once, and that assumption is wrong, which matters. Even Mark seems to feel it. When he imagines multiple superintelligences restraining each other at the far end of this, he writes, if some or all of those superintelligences were somehow benevolent, then they could check and balance each other. Somehow. 6,500 words to protect the future of our species and prevent potential catastrophes, and the critical word to protect us all is somehow. So last, and really importantly, let's get to the concept of cost, because cost is at the bottom of everything we do, the brass tacks, if you will. What does it cost you? And there are some disturbing trends in Mark's manifesto when we view it through this lens, because firstly, a serious moral philosophy costs its philosopher and its author something, somewhere. It tells you that a thing that you want is a thing that you shouldn't really have. So, is there a single principle in this manifesto that Mark Zuckerberg holds against his own self-interest? No, there isn't. I really can't find one. It turns out that the ideal future is the one that aligns most with Meta's business model and with Mark's wealth. Who could have known? Because the morally correct AI turns out to be a personal one, a consumer-facing one, and delivered at a many billion user scale, which is Meta's product. It's the point of distinction over its competitors because, well, it has to be. And also, the morally correct ecosystem also turns out to run on open models. Who would have guessed it? Which Meta wants too, because it is quite far behind OpenAI and Anthropic, who sell closed ones. And also, the morally correct government settings turn out to be faster permitting, more energy, no delays on model releases, freedom to distill an American leadership, which is Meta's lobbying wish list, item for item. At no point does the moral thing to do, the limits articulated in this manifesto to bring about the positive future of superintelligence, constrain Meta or Mark Zuckerberg. And here's my favourite footnote to all of this. Mark has published this manifesto before, first to shareholders and then to those business readers who've had paid access to the Wall Street Journal. And in an earlier draft of the manifesto, it had the line, "We believe the benefits of superintelligence should be shared with the world as broadly as possible." That said, superintelligence will raise novel safety concerns. We'll need to be rigorous about mitigating these risks and careful about what we choose to open source. Over a year later, those sentences are gone, and open models have been promoted from a risk to a moral principle. So what changed in that time? Well, will it surprise you to learn that it is not the science of model safety, but Meta's competitive position? Out of an individual economic imperative, a risk has been promoted to a virtue. Given this, I think we should be very careful about the motivated reasoning in this manifesto. You will say that's obvious, but philosophers usually default to the principle of charity and trust when trying to make sense of another philosopher's work. But there are special occasions where further skepticism is warranted, and this is very much one of them. Plus, there's also a deep logical asymmetry in the document, which once you see it, you'll realize the whole thing is riddled with it, because whenever the vision in this manifesto delivers benefits, the sentence has individuals in it. It's your agent, your business, your empowerment, supplied by Meta. But whenever these AI superintelligences deliver risks, that's someone else's problem, not Meta's, who is delivering to us these potentially dangerous superintelligences. Because, hey, companies with frontier models should spend significant resources hardening critical infrastructure, not Meta. Government should update its policies and limit access to harmful materials, not Meta. Institutions, yes, the same ones that Mark disparaged in the first part, if they begin to see harmful examples emerge, should adjust their strategies, not Meta. Yes, we're all trying to find the guy who did this, says Meta from its crashed hot dog car. But also, Mark inserts a little caveat after each of these cautions, saying that even addressing these serious risks should not slow down the pace of model innovation or restrict or delay individuals' access to personal superintelligence. Basically, he's arguing, I should not be constrained, and no government should hold the power to tell me no, but every risk my actions create is somebody else's job to manage. That logic isn't surprising because it is, after all, the logic of corporatism. In 1906, even, Ambrose Bierce gave us one of the classic definitions of corporation, which was corporation, noun, an ingenious device for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility. And is that not this manifesto in a nutshell? So, Mark's selective comfort from history, his flawed political theory, and his motivated reasoning kind of doom this manifesto. In a philosophical sense, I mean, because from a practical sense, he has the billions. He has the political influence. He's doing it. He's just done us the favour of laying out the bare reasoning that underpins the future he's already trying to build. So where does that leave us? Well, philosophers do strive to be fair and reasonable, and there are quite a few things about Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto that I think he's actually right about. He is right that we need a philosophy of AI, and fortunately there are a lot of outstanding philosophers and centres working on this, many of them in the institutions he disparaged. He's also right that asking questions about AI and superintelligence is also asking questions about power, not just questions about software and technologies. But I think we very much learned that by now too, particularly from our first dance with initially fun platforms and innovations like Facebook that turned into political and social perils. And again, he's right that new kinds of work will exist. My grandparents worked jobs that my great-grandparents couldn't even have imagined, and so on down to me, a man who explains Heidegger on the internet. And the balance of power idea is worth interrogating further, even if the vision and the mechanism that Mark proposes aren't really up to it. But this manifesto is not that philosophy or that investigation. In fact, it is barely philosophy, but I think you suspected that all along, right? Because philosophy is the practice of exposing your beliefs to standards and to criticisms that could revise them. And this document does the opposite. In fact, there is a very old word for what this document does do. It's ideology. It's a picture of the world, or in this case, a future, that makes one set of arrangements, contingent, chosen, profitable arrangements, sound reasonable, natural, and inevitable. It was right there in the opening claim that superintelligence is inevitable. It's there when Meta's product strategy becomes our empowerment, when regulation becomes tyranny in waiting, and it's there where there is a specific business model that becomes the required path to a positive future for our species. Most importantly, at no point in the manifesto does Mark Zuckerberg address the question of what all of this will cost us and whether it is worth it. He never asks, at what cost would this stop being worth it? The big question, in other words, because that, in the most ideological move of all, that superintelligence is worth the costs, the risks, and the lost futures and alternatives, is assumed to be right from the start. But hey, we can ask those questions. We can demand that they be addressed and that people like Mark Zuckerberg answers them. And for a change, it does look like our political systems are finally listening. We can have a say in what we do, what we choose, and how we govern this stuff. We can keep asking of AI, who owns it? Who controls it? Who benefits? Who carries the risks? What happens to everybody else when power compounds? And the question underneath all of those, whether every future we can build is a future worth building. Mark Zuckerberg wrote this manifesto, I suspect, because he has realised that we are demanding answers to these questions. And I'm guessing he suspects that we might prevent him from doing anything further until he answers them. So let's do that. Let's withhold our moral and our social license and our assent until he and the entire tech bro apparatus have better answers. The kick in the pants, for me, the reason I made this video, the bit that made me furious enough to actually sit down and record this, which means that now I can stop being a reasonable philosopher and just rant about this a bit, is that the manifesto ends by obnoxiously borrowing Martin Luther King's rhetoric of the moral arc, King who himself was borrowing it from the abolitionist preacher Theodore Parker. Parker and King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Mark's version bends towards putting more power in people's hands, and the difference between those two visions is everything. Parker was describing a moral order he admitted he could not see. King was describing the worth of a struggle for a better tomorrow that he knew to be righteous. Mark is describing a product roadmap that he can sell. Fine, one last point, if you'll indulge me. A month before this manifesto promised human liberation, Meta's own CTO, Andrew Bosworth, was asked whether AI's productivity gains might mean more time off for the rest of us and for his staff. His answer was, quote, "I hope that what we do with our extra time is to do even more and cooler stuff for the users who use our products every day." Mark's manifesto promises us freedom, but caveat emptor. As always, we should read the fine print. But that's all for now. So until next time, be wise and be kind and go on, get out of here. That dog isn't going to pat itself.